This is the beautiful Havana skyline. Christopher Columbus landed on this lush tropical island inhabited by American Indians in 1492. He claimed it for Spain, obviously. The Spaniards who followed used the peaceful Indians as slaves for the tobacco plantation. Thousands and thousands died from the brutal treatment, and more died from the diseases brought by the Europeans, who, by the way, brought no women at first, but fathered children with the Indian women. There was a gradual extinction of the Indians, so today you see no American Indians in Cuba. That is a black man pointing in the direction of Key West, Florida, just 90 miles away. Havana, the capital city with a population of 2.2 million. Cienfuegos, a charming city where we visited Rebecca Langas, who heads the city's small Jewish community. Bay of Pigs, otherwise known as the beach at Playa Larga. Trinidad, a World Heritage Site where we spent 2 days. This is not the island of Trinidad, but a city in Cuba. Guantanamo, where the United States established a naval base in 1903. While Cuba is the largest island in the West Indies, it is still slightly smaller than the state of Ohio. From northwest to southeast, it's only 708 miles long. From its widest point, only 135 miles from north to south. And there is Key West, Florida, just 90 miles away. And there is Miami, with its extensive Cuban exile population. There are about 2,500 Cuban Jewish households in Miami-Dade County. You will see many, many black people, like that man you saw pointing across to Florida, because the Spaniards of Columbus's time imported African slaves in large numbers to work the tobacco and then the sugar plantations. Still more black slaves came on their own to escape rebellion in nearby Haiti. Today, the majority of the black population in Cuba is mulatto or black. Since over 1 million white people have left Cuba since Castro, a majority population of mulatto and black is of course not surprising. The city's restaurants, cafes, hotels are lively with music. There are about 15,000 well-trained professional musicians, and jobs are hard to find in all fields. The government salary is about $25 a month, believe it, whether they're doctors, teachers, factory workers, or bus drivers. Everyone wants to work in the tourist industry, for the tips, of course. This is Old Havana, or Havana Viejo, the oldest part of the city and with the most history. There are always preservation projects going on, restoring special homes, museums, city squares, streets, with much architectural, cultural, and historic value. This was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1982 because more than 300 of Havana's 3,000 colonial structures are of historical importance, dating back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Only 1 in 6 buildings is in good condition. This is one of the streets where the colonial homes have been restored. I'd like to briefly read to you the role of the United States in Cuban history. In 1898, we supported the Cuban revolutionaries during the Spanish-American War, forcing Spain to give up its claims in Cuba. Then from 1899 to 1902, We set up a United States military government when Cuba became a republic. In 1903, the United States got a lease on Guantanamo Bay and built a naval base there. In 1942, we gave Batista economic aid when Cuba entered the Second World War on our side. That meant we can use Cuban airfields. And we leased Guantanamo Bay for 99 more years. In 1959, we supported Castro, who overthrew the dictator Batista, until Castro accepted Soviet military and economic aid from Russia. In 1960, we forced the Soviet Union to remove missiles from Cuba, and we placed an economic embargo on Cuba. In 1994, in 1 month, 35,000 Cubans fled Cuba in unsafe boats, and the United States agreed to accept 20,000 Cuban refugees a year. Other than the blacks, there were the Chinese immigrants. In the 19th century, some 150,000 Chinese came to work as laborers with 8-year contracts. Many stayed on, and more arrived later and also stayed, intermarrying with the blacks and mulattoes. At the time of the revolution in 1959, the communists, and Fidel Castro of course, took over the government. They wanted to distribute the land equally, and they did a pretty good job, we were told. People who were renting homes or paying mortgages were absolved of those responsibilities, and they were given their homes to use. So, what if they no longer wanted to live in their home? For various reasons. It's too big, it's too small, whatever. Remember, since there's no longer any free enterprise, you can't sell your home either. Everything, including your home, belongs to the state. So the people would gather here regularly, and they would try to trade their homes. Most of the time, we stayed at the Hotel Telegrafo, right in the heart of Havana Vieja, or Old Havana. This hotel has been an old landmark in Havana, then allowed to run down when Castro took over. Now, it has been completely remodeled for tourists and has air conditioning, cable TV, with even CNN. But when we walked into the lobby, it was like being back into the 1950s in the United States, as far as the Art Deco style was concerned. Cuba has little access or money for municipal restoration since the U.S. embargo. Of course, we couldn't use any credit cards or traveler's checks that were drawn on a U.S. bank. Our cell phones don't work in Cuba. And as for computers, in the hotel there were 2 with email access, but you have to sign up in advance for a time to use one, and it doesn't always work. The president of the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Cuba, Mr. Russo, met us in the lobby to tell us about the Jews in Cuba. There is no right of assembly without a permit, so we had to sit in the lobby with him. He said emphatically that there is no anti-Semitism in Cuba, now or not before Castro. When asked about the Communist Party, he said that he is a proud member of the party and that you must apply for membership, and it is a great honor to be selected. When asked if he thinks that communism is the way to go, with so many countries rejecting communism, he said no form of government is perfect, and that we have gotten off the topic, and that was the end of our conversation. And incidentally, we saw him at the temple on Friday night. This is El Patronado, or the Jewish Center, with communal activities and the community pharmacy and the conservative synagogue called Beit Shalom, where we incidentally happened to see Mr. Russo at services. We are bringing medical supplies here. We could not enter Cuba without good purpose, so each of us carried about 10 pounds of medical supplies in our suitcases for distribution. And now, under the auspices of the Sephardic Friendship Committee, we are legally allowed entry into the country as a humanitarian mission. El Patronado was built in 1951. Unfortunately, in 1999 there was an extremely damaging hurricane, and the money to restore this beautiful building came from American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation and from the Weinberg Foundation in Baltimore, Maryland. There is a picture in the lobby taken in 1994 of Castro in the lobby with some of the young Jewish people. El Patronado serves free lunches daily and the dinner on weekends, enabling Jewish families to stretch out their meager rations. And because Passover foods are hard to obtain, the Canadian Jewish Congress, among others, send quantities of holiday goodies. This is a rum factory. Rum is a major industry.
If you can wait there.
They store some of these rum barrels for as much as 100 years. Now we're leaving the rum factory. This is an 80-year-old former mansion, now lovingly run by nuns for a handful of elderly people, including Jews, who live there and have caregivers if needed. About 35 neighborhood elderly come in daily for meals and daycare, but there are many other elderly who are not so lucky and have to get by on $3 a month in their own quarters. This is the Cuban Capitol building, built by the United States, and looks like our Capitol building in Washington, D.C., except Cuba's is 6 inches taller. Our guide proudly tells us. Enough of walking the hot but interesting streets of old Cuba. We are going to see the huge, colorful market in a comfortable air-conditioned bus. It is ours for the week, along with our own English-speaking young guide and driver. This is the huge public market. Almost every conceivable food is available. These huge municipal city buses are called camels because of their shape. Such interesting ways to get around. We took a bicycle taxi a couple of times. It was inexpensive. These cocoa cabs are unique to Cuba. Aren't they cute?
Clock, 12 o'clock, rock, we're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Those old American cars from the 1950s are treasured and kept in great shape. If you were lucky, you may have inherited one. Our bus driver did, and when he got married, he traded it for a small house. But the classic cars are difficult to maintain because with the embargo, American parts are not available. Gas comes from Venezuela and it's $3.75 a gallon, sold by the liter. And the state owns all the taxis, buses, and gas, of course. This is the University of Havana, built in 1929. Education was Castro's other priority, the first year of the revolution. And Cubans are proud of their country's educational record since the revolution. In 1958, there were almost 1 million illiterate people in Cuba, and over 2/3 of the rural population had no schools. In 1961, Castro closed all the schools in Cuba for 8 months, and sent 250,000 students and teachers into rural areas to teach people how to read and write. In 1 year, the illiteracy rate dropped to 4%. Old police stations were converted into schools, and thousands of volunteers built new ones. Today, education is free for everyone, from kindergarten to university, and the 95% literacy level is among the highest in developing countries. But there aren't enough pencils and papers. Go figure. Today, students have a choice of 8 universities and 50 institutes of higher learning. In addition, vocational schools offer courses in agriculture, industry, and technology. Unfortunately, education does not lead to a comfortable living in a socialistic state. Remember, you work for the state, and you average $25 a month. What is that building?
This building, this is Hotel National.
The what?
Hotel National.
Oh, that's the Hotel Nacional.
Okay.
Nacional. This is a Vegas-style nightclub in the Hotel Nacional. It really is a first-class production. On the side of this building in Havana, you can see this huge painting of Che Guevara wearing his military beret. Incidentally, the children of Havana, I will mention, begin the school day with the slogan, "Pioneers of communism, we shall be like Che." We will be taking a 5-hour bus trip to the city of Trinidad. On the way, a bit of Cuban history. A crab attack, but they weren't part of the revolution.
The whole army.
Che Guevara, the beloved national hero who is now dead, had been important to the revolution. In 1956, Che of Argentina and Fidel of Cuba met for the first time in Mexico. They planned the takeover of Cuba from the dictator Batista. They left Mexico in a second-hand yacht with about 82 men, and they landed on the eastern coast of Cuba, where they encountered Batista's forces. But they escaped into the mountains, and from their mountain hiding place, they began to create the rebel army, which was the start of the 1959 revolution. They received good press in the United States until Castro signed an economic treaty with the Soviet Union and accepted Soviet military and financial aid in 1960. The United States then placed a trade embargo on Cuba, as our concern was a communist country supported by the Soviet Union 90 miles off our shore. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, Cuba lost its tremendous Soviet subsidies, and Cuba is still trying to recuperate from that loss. And the United States embargo since 1960 keeps Cuba from earning US dollars, which is absolutely essential in a global economy for importing necessities to run their own industry. We stopped a while for lunch at this hotel. He's hungry too. She wouldn't play the piano unless I gave her a buck. Our other negotiations I prefer not to discuss. This is the old town of Trinidad. In 1514, Trinidad was Spain's third settlement in Cuba. It was from here that Cortez organized men and supplies for his conquests of Mexico for Spain. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Trinidad's biggest wealth came from sugarcane, sugar mills, tobacco, cattle raising, and leather. These are the grand old homes that had living quarters upstairs and warehouses on the ground floor. And the original cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and old tile roofs still remain. There was no highway in this isolated city until 1950, so nothing really changed much. Now buildings of the 1700s are being restored and are used for museums complete with furniture, paintings, and family possessions of the period. The young people are sent here for training in iron and woodwork and to help in the restoration. For 2 nights we stayed at the elegant tourist resort called Trinidad del Mar. A little distance from here, but we came back here for dinner and entertainment each night. Dinner would be in a paladar. That is a private home licensed to serve up to 14 people any night and using only family members to cook and serve. That gives Cuba a substitute for restaurants they may not have, and the poor Cubans a way to make extra cash dollars. Entertainment will be some local talent, a bit of dancing and drinking and music, which is a combination of African and Spanish melodies. On the way back to Havana, we stopped in the city of Cienfuegos to see Rebecca Langus, leader of the small Jewish community of 9 families, 27 people in all. Since 1993, she has had Friday night services in her home. Her husband is not Jewish. At times, her group gets together with other small Jewish groups in nearby Santa Clara, where they have a Torah. Her parents and grandparents came from Turkey, probably during World War II. Some other Jews are also from Turkey or Poland. We asked if the government allows them to have services. She said all religions are supported by the government. How? By being given a meeting place if needed, and by being allowed to meet in her house. Circumcision, for instance, is done for Jewish boys and is paid for by the government. For non-Jews, we guess probably not, as it's generally not done in Latin American countries. There really was a limit to our asking delicate questions. As we return to Havana, let me tell you briefly about the Jews in Cuba. Many had emigrated to Cuba in the 1920s and 1930s, so that by 1959, they comprised a respectable percentage of Cuba's business community. They were, therefore, among the first victims of the revolution, as Castro took over businesses. Cuban Jews began arriving in Miami in 1960, along with a mass exodus of other Cubans seeking political asylum in the United States. Today there are about 2,500 Cuban Jewish households. Unlike Jews from other parts of the world who emigrated at various times, with most of their assets, the Cuban Jews were taken by surprise and fled with nothing. Some went to Puerto Rico or New York, but most went to Miami and slowly opened small shops in downtown Miami selling textiles and dry goods as they had done in Cuba. Cuba's relations with the United States deteriorated quickly as reform also led to nationalization of American-owned sugar plantations, cattle ranches, and oil refineries. The Americans lost everything. This is the Bay of Pigs, where 1,300 Cuban exiles landed. The CIA had been working with them, planning an invasion of Cuba. They were met by 20,000 of Castro's troops. It was a disaster. The Cuban exiles were annihilated. A year later, when the U.S. learned that Cuba had a number of long-range missiles capable of targeting U.S. cities, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to prevent further shipments arriving from the Soviet Union. He demanded that all missiles and missile bases be removed from Cuba. For days, the world held its breath. Finally, the Soviets agreed, but only after the United States agreed not to invade Cuba. That was the historic Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the area of the blockade. These are Soviet missile bases. This is the Bay of Pigs. This is the United States Naval Base in Key West, Florida. And this is the United States Air Force Base in Miami. When we returned to Havana, we visited the Orthodox synagogue, Synagogue Adeth, Israel, founded in 1925 in a different location with mostly German and Romanian Jews. This is much smaller than the synagogue and Jewish center we saw a few days ago. In 1956, the synagogue could afford to move to their present location. And I might add, incidentally, built with no outstanding mortgage. Today it serves 125 families and has 3 services daily. The synagogue is also in charge of the Jewish cemetery and preparations for burial. The government helps with the building restoration. This is the National Ballet of Cuba. We saw The Enchanted Shrimp by Jose Marti, the man Cubans call father of their country. He was also a poet and a writer. And as a 15-year-old student, he began his crusade against Spanish colonialism and was sent to prison for treason. Shortly after, he was pardoned, went to a law school in Spain, eventually settling in New York. He passionately felt the United States should have no control over Cuba and spread the message to other Cuban exiles. He urged independence for Cuba, stressing the need for democracy, social justice, and racial equality. Unfortunately, Jose Marti died 7 years before Cuba became an independent republic. This is the monument of Ernest Hemingway, literary Nobel Prize winner. He had been staying in Havana at a local hotel, but when he sold his movie rights to For Whom the Bell Tolls, he bought a home. He fished in the neighboring town of Cojimar. It was there that he had the inspiration for The Old Man and the Sea. The Elian Gonzalez statue. Little Elian is being carried by San Martin, a Cuban saint. And the anniversary of his return, they have a big party here. We spent a little time learning about the unique Afro-Cuban religion called Santeria, brought to Cuba by slaves. It is a mixture of belief in spirits and love of a saint. Priests help followers communicate with the spirits.
The chain with the cocoa is one form of divination called Ifa.
This is El Rapido. It is a fast food place. For example, spaghetti is $1. All prices are in US dollars, and they won't take pesos. Our farewell dinner at a private club in the wealthy Miramar area.
good trip, but now it's over. And Ro from Escapes Limited, in fact she owns the company, and she was our tour escort. She and her teenage daughter were with us, and then they stayed on for 3 weeks. They went to school for Spanish, they went to University of Havana, and I have a question for you, Ro. We were there as tourists. When we left, you weren't a tourist anymore. Tell us a little bit about how you fared as far as the people, the food.
Well, life changed very dramatically for us the minute you left. We moved to an apartment which was on the 4th floor with a non-working elevator in a normal residential area. And then we went grocery shopping at a market, which was the big neighborhood market. The big neighborhood market had very little of what we considered food that, was adequate for our purposes. We couldn't find eggs. We found lettuce. The only vegetable we found was string beans one time. And then we scrounged around and finally got some cucumbers. Well, so we weren't eating meat because that didn't look good. We didn't want just the starches of rice and beans and pasta because that was too heavy, and we couldn't find any vegetables. Hence, we had a problem. We really had to scrounge for food.
Well, are the people complaining? And, we never saw anything from a political point of view as tourists. Tell me about that.
Well, I don't know if the people are actually complaining. I think that the people have a certain amount of fear that they live with. Each neighborhood has something called the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, and that committee, whoever they may be in each neighborhood, keeps an eye on everybody in the neighborhood, so everybody conforms. It's easier and less hassle. There's no immediate repercussions if you complain or if you don't sign petitions or if you don't march when you're supposed to. But there are long-term repercussions. And I think the Cubans have just accepted that this is what it is. And I guess it used to be much worse.
What do you mean by long-term repercussions?
If you don't sign the petitions or go on marches or do what is expected of you, you may not find yourself promoted job-wise. You might find that your child doesn't get put into the school that you want them in. You might find that your family doesn't get a vacation. Or when your refrigerator goes out and you need a new compressor, you may not get one. That's how the system works.
What do you see as the future, the immediate future for Cuba, like the embargo, for example?
Well, I think that the U.S. will lift the embargo, but I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference because I think that Fidel will limit the number of tourists going to Cuba, partly because there's no infrastructure, there's not enough hotel space, there are not enough buses, and we know the restaurants are not well stocked. There's not enough food. So whether we lift the embargo or not, I think the number of tourists to Cuba will be restricted. And the restriction will come by prices going way up and thereby limiting the number of people who can afford to go. And I think it's going to come from Cuba after we lift the embargo. And I think we will get around to lifting the embargo.
Well, that's from a tourist point of view, but from the local people there, won't they be better off when the embargo is lifted?
Well, technically, if they can get more dollars into their economy, they would definitely be better off. But how far that will trickle down, to the people on the street, I have no idea.
I thought that it wouldn't cost as much for them to import food, for example, if they could get it from, say, Miami rather than thousands of miles away.
Well, that part is probably true. And we may be willing to subsidize the Cuban economy. We're usually pretty generous as a country doing that kind of thing. So that may very well be the case. But who's to know now how that's going to play out? I think the feeling that I have is that as long as Fidel is alive, not much is going to change. I think the real changes will come about after he's gone.
Well, Ro, that was certainly different than our perspective of Cuba as tourists. Thank you so much for telling us.
Well, Cuba really is two different pictures, the one we saw as tourists and the one we lived after you left. and the differences were very dramatic, very interesting.
Thank you.
Si baila cachete con cachete, pechito con pechito y ombligo con ombligo. Así me animo a bailar contigo. Bailar contigo si tienes motivo. Porque si juntamos los cachetes, juntamos los pechitos y juntamos el ombligo. Moviendo si se siente de lo lindo. Bailamos si se siente divertido. Bailamos cachete con cachete. Juntamos pechito con pechito. Movemos ombligo con ombligo. Y si nos gusta, junta todo lo seguimos. ¿Y qué tal si salimos todos a bailar? ¿Y qué tal si salimos todos a bailar? Aquello con aquello, lo de ella con lo de ello, lo tuyo con lo mío, con ritmo nos movemos. ¿Y qué tal si salimos todos a bailar? ¿Y qué tal si salimos todos a bailar? Aquello con aquello, lo de ella con lo de ello, lo tuyo con lo mío, con ritmo nos movemos.